The student who is presenting next is Marc Guagenti, who's from Rutgers University, and he will be presenting his work entitled Standing to Blame, Temporal Considerations. And you should have a handout. Thank you.
First, I want to thank Dr. Miller for organizing this conference and everyone here for showing up. I also want to thank, though he's not here, I want to thank my professor so much for his help with this. And what I'm going to be talking to you about today is kind of a technical problem in the value theory literature. Specifically, this is about blame. In 1963, P.F. Strawson published Freedom and Resentment, which kind of exploded the blame literature. And even though he doesn't talk much about blame in that particular work, blame has become a hot center in moral psychology and moral philosophy. So let me start by telling you what I take blame to be. Blame is a pluralistically instantiated phenomenon, which involves a negative evaluation of some actor along normative lines, and usually also condemning that actor for that moral sort of wrong. So by that, I need to make sure to say that blame isn't used in the kind of terminology sometimes we hear in folk speech, such as just a kind of causal responsibility. Instead, I'm talking about blame as a particular kind of phenomenon in which a state could blame, but usually it's the blame of some agent for doing some wrong. But I can get later to what exactly I take blame to be. But I will say for my particular story here, it's both a cognitive or reactive attitudes account would work. That is, one person blaming another. So standing to blame is broadly construed as a moral property, a property that is positional. It can be thought of in three different ways. So say standing is something like the position people occupy in relationship to each other. It could also be the person standing in relation to morality itself. And some people think of standing as possible objections one could raise to someone who is blaming the other. That is, the blamee can say, you don't have standing to say this, X, Y, Z are also like this. So the most important condition here, and this is actually, it should probably just be mostly about hypocrisy. And also, I changed the title, I forgot to mention this. It's called Atemporal Consideration, because the idea of getting to two was ridiculous. So the non-hypocrisy condition. Throughout the literature, the general consensus is when a person has been hypocritical, or they are hypocritical, that is, a blamer has engaged in some sort of wrong that is related to the blamee, they don't have standing. That is, standing is undermined by hypocrisy. So the non-hypocrisy condition has been widely investigated, conceptualized in a variety of different ways, some in the moral psychological literature about people's folk understanding of what it takes for someone to be undermined, and there's a lot of different conceptualizations of it. But my task today will be to investigate R.J. Wallace's 2010 article. I'm sorry, let me look at what the title is. Hypocrisy, Moral Dress, and the Equal Standing of Persons. And today I'm going to take a responsibility for attitudes account, apply it to Wallace's his story about hypocritical blame and standing, and show that I think Wallace has made an omission, or perhaps even a mistake. We'll find, I'm doubtful, but let's go through it. So R.J. Wallace's account. Wallace notes that people are often mentally incoherent and inconsistent. That is, people, moral psychologically speaking, are disposed to not actually be able to, say, remember their own wrongdoing or understand it. So there's a little bit of what he doesn't term hypocrisy. He doesn't think inconsistency and incoherence mentally are hypocrisy. He thinks hypocrisy can only be instantiated via overt forms of actual talk, which I find very strange, but that will be my entire argument. So what he takes it to be, the inconsistency and incoherence, is the lack of systematicity that an average person actually has in their moral psychological thinking and their mentation about certain other people, the people they're blaming in our account. And so what Wallace takes to be wrong is something he terms hypocritical moral dress, which is just generally the non-hypocrisy condition yet again, but this time in its overt blaming form, and only the overt blaming form. I might add, I should have added this, Fritz and Miller, 2018, note themselves that there's almost no actual literature on mental standing to blame. All of it is focused on the overt form, and I think for good reason, as my case will probably fall to pieces shortly. In this account, the blamer, so in the account that we're talking about with Wallace, what is revealed by the blamer differentially blaming themselves and others is what Wallace calls a lack of commitment to critical self-scrutiny. That is, hypocritical moral dress takes place when a person privileges the other person's wrongdoing over their own. That is, the hypocritical blamer is violating the equal standing of persons under morality by not applying the same kind of criteria to their own morally negative behavior. That's not a good way to put it, but let's go on. So what is it that I take to be wrong? I'm first going to use a hypothetical case, and hopefully that hypothetical case will show you that what I will hope to do with it is kind of push against Wallace a little bit. So suppose that Johann is walking down a busy road and sees hotshot lawyer David push an 8-year-old child out of his way to get to an important meeting. Johann's first thought is to blame David. This is unreflective and involuntary. Johann both morally condemns him and finds him culpable for his wrongdoing. I don't know if this is partially a reactive attitudes account, that it's neither here nor there. However, Johann has a rich and sordid history of pushing children on busy roads and is completely unrepentant about it. Now imagine the same case, but Johann yells at David. This time he does what Wallace would call hypocritical moral address. What is fundamentally different between these two cases? And I'd say not enough to preclude standing, an analysis of standing, and not enough to say that mental cases are just inconsistency. So let me now take to Angela Smith's fantastic 2005 article, Responsibility for Attitudes, Activity and Passivity in Mental Life. So we often blame or hold other people accountable for attitudes that are non-volitional. That is, it is often the case that we blame people for what we infer to be their intentional mental content or lack thereof. That is, this intentional mental content is actually what we're ascribing to when we morally blame others. The behavior is a way of inferring these mental states. For Smith, this means that one can be held responsible for thoughts, which is what I was getting at. That is, voluntarism is not a necessary condition for moral evaluation. Smith points out a pretty interesting little observation, which is, could you say someone is morally responsible for forgetting someone's birthday? It seems to be the case that, in fact, there is a behavioral thing, but it doesn't seem like this actually instantiates any sort of property besides a lack of attention or a lack of knowledge about what is actually ongoing. Instead, what Smith takes to be the kind of things that are morally valuable are actually things that are intentional, that are generally intentional mental content or lack thereof. So, what her responsibility for attitudes account goes against a lot of what I think, and I wouldn't want to characterize the literature too broadly, is a lot of voluntarism, a lot of focus on volition, and a lot of focus on culpability as understood through particular rational processes. Though Smith's account is actually about our ability to rationally judge our own behavior, and via this rational judgment, come to different understandings of ourselves and change ourselves. So this is partially a rational attitude, but there's a difference between activity and passivity that I can't quite get to right now because I don't have the strength and probably not the time. But so here's my argument, and this is going to be using Smith a lot. Wallace's criteria are fundamentally mental. That's what I'm going to assert. Yet his account focuses on a voluntary overt action, hypocritical moral address. I believe with his criteria in hand and with Smith's account of responsibility, it seems that a hypocritical thought can undermine standing. That is, the analysis of standing is again not precluded by simply having overt hypocrisy. If we look at the case of Johann, it doesn't seem that much has changed about the actual content of, nothing has changed about the content of his thought. I don't know if I mentioned this in the overt case, but let's say he just simply spats out unreflectively and kind of almost non-voluntarily, maybe that's a better way of putting it. He doesn't actually think particularly carefully and just shouts out in the second case. In the first case, he simply doesn't shout it out. That is, why is it suddenly that it's no longer morally valuable when both of those mental states were very similar, except one of them, I guess, instantiated some sort of physical phenomenon in which he talked? So, oftentimes our initial reaction is like other mental specs, reflective of our irrational attitudes, as Smith explains. So what this means is she often talks about these rational evaluations are often like commitment. Now this is exactly where I take Wallace to actually have not given us criteria just for overt blame, but criteria for unreflective mental blame. That is, the commitment to self-scrutiny is actually something that's often, and I will also mention this, I should probably go back to this, but Wallace himself actually has responsibility for sentiment's account, so it was completely unclear to me why he was arguing this way for his particular account only being overt. I can actually give you a little bit of a story of why I take that to be later. But basically what I'm trying to get at is, it seems to me that the commitment to self-scrutiny is an attitudinal thing. In fact, Wallace's account does not preclude a mental standing thing, some sort of analysis of mental standing. In fact, even if we take standing to be, I did mention earlier what the three kinds of standing were. It seems to me that he doesn't think standing is just relational. He thinks standing is some sort of positional property that has to do with a person's relation to morality. If that's the case, I think I've very much pushed down his case, because it seems like there could be no difference between the mental blame and the actual physical version of blame that I gave from Johann the second time. Now, there are a couple of different questions here, but I'll get to them in a second. But so what I take it to be is that Johann's mental attitude shows that he's preferentially blaming others and not himself in the first case, because he's unrepentant and does not believe in and he's violating the equal standing of persons by not being committed to critical self-scrutiny, and therefore he does not have standing to blame. So even the initial reaction, even without expression, and even without voluntarism, I don't want to say volitional control, I don't know why I said that, manifests the same problem Wallace sees in hypocritical express blame. That is, his criteria get me what I want. Now the only thing is, I just want to say that Wallace is kind of assertoric in the beginning about this whole inconsistency and incoherence idea about mental blame. I think I've shown that it's at least plausible, if not that this judgment is veridical or anything, just that the idea that we could possibly have mental standing. So one of the questions, the first question is, this seems kind of ridiculous for a couple different reasons prudentially. My professor brought up a great point. Let's take Johann, who's a child pusher, right? And then let's take counter-ruled Johann. Now, the Johann I'm talking about is someone who's a hypocrite, right? But the Johann in the other world just doesn't care. So that is, he pushes children, but he has no attention-directing blame. So he doesn't have any reactive attitudes. Doesn't it seem that one of those people is moral psychologically actually superior? That is, even the first person being hypocritical is actually less preferable to the person who doesn't actually pay attention to the wrongdoing of others. So the basic idea is, what am I trying to talk about here? I actually don't have many practical or pragmatic considerations from this argument. The moral psychological picture is complex and incomplete. There's ongoing things. There's people who think people have universal standing to blame. There's people who actually insist that people's hypocrisy is a good thing for people being moral psychologically oriented in the world to act in an overall better beneficent manner, because if we were to constantly think about our own hypocrisy, it would be kind of bad. But again, what I'm saying is I have no judgment about that. So, as I said, this account doesn't speak to practical considerations, and it's agnostic about compliance concerns about optimal moral psychology. As several philosophers have argued, hypocrisy is useful. I think hypocrisy and the whole standing to blame literature, I think I've been really tough on Wallace here, and I just want to say that Wallace's article is amazing, and it's way better than anything I could have written. It's just that I did take issue with the whole mental thing, and I will also say other people have done similar work to myself. Todd, in his 2017 A Unified Account of the Moral Standing to Blame, also takes it to be the case that mental blame is also valuable under the non-hypocrisy condition, but in a bit different way than I am. So I also want to bring out another temporal consideration as I end this talk. I think the literature is very bereft of this particular kind of thing. Now, Fritz and Miller do an interesting job of trying to show this, but to what extent and how long can hypocrisy undermine our standing? If we take standing to be an actual moral property, to what extent could it possibly be the case that someone doing something blameworthy in the past means that they shouldn't be able to blame now? Because, what is it, 10 years, 5 years? Does it depend on the person's current mental disposition? Does it actually just matter about the moral quality and how separate they are temporally through time? Or does it have to do with their current psychological dispositions? And again, that's another temporal consideration for another time. So thank you all.
Thank you, Marc. So we have time for questions.
Thanks for the talk. That was a lot of ground covered very quickly, so I'm not positive that it's going to be as good as I want it to be. But I'm kind of curious about the difference between the difference that you seem to be trying to undermine between blaming someone internally and expressing it overtly. Wouldn't it be an important difference between the two, that if I express it overtly, I am signaling to others around that I think this, and so inviting the charge of hypocrisy more
Okay. So, yeah.
strongly?
So there's kind of different, Yeah, okay. So there's kind of different accounts of standing. There's one that's kind of relational, where it actually seems like, in my relational account, I'm kind of having a hard time here, right? Because if standing is simply a property that is just relational, it seems that the overt expression seems like it's going to get us more problematized, my account. So mine is a standing relation in morality. Now, you could also say, as you're saying, that there's going to be moral properties that might happen when someone physically blames. What I don't want to say here, and I think maybe physically instantiates a blame behavior, whatever the hell it is, what I want to say here is that I'm not talking about practical considerations. And I also want to push against the, I guess what I want to say is, it doesn't seem to me that I'm actually making a case that these are overt and covert are the same level. I'm talking about a particular kind of standing. I've said it hasn't been precluded, but it doesn't mean that saying it isn't going to be much worse in many, many circumstances. And this is only one property of standing, which is standing to blame in terms of your own hypocrisy, not standing relationally in the actual world to other relations or to morality in general or to prudential concerns about how this blaming might actually affect others. So yeah, but you're completely right, yeah.
Just a quick, so near the end you had the two hypothetical Johans, the one who shoves children and says nothing, and the one who shoves children and blames others for shoving children as well. I'm wondering, so you had said the one that shoves children and blames others is sort of morally worse than the one who just shoves children.
No, I probably went through that too quickly. One mentally blames, the other overtly blames.
Right,
so
yeah.
did both, wait, I'm sorry. You're talking about the end. I'm sorry. Yes, yeah.
The shoves children doesn't care what anyone else does. The one that shoves children and either mentally or outwardly blames.
Yeah.
I'm wondering, I guess it depends on I guess how you're evaluating that as to whether that outwardly blaming is, while it's clearly inconsistent with that Johann, if that is necessarily a worse position to take, given that outwardly blaming might lead to shaming, might lead to changing behavior.
Yes. No, that was. I'm sorry, I didn't make that clear. That was exactly my professor's point when he critiqued my position.
Oh, sorry.
You're making the exact right point, which is it actually seems that the person who's a hypocrite might be preferable.
Okay.
And so that's why I was trying to speak to the idea that this doesn't speak to moral psychological considerations of what's optimal. It's only an attack on Wallace and an insistence on responsibility for attitudes and intentional mental content being the inferences we make about people's moral behavior. But yes, that's perfectly right, yeah.
So I think just a point of clarification, if you define hypocrisy, I might have missed it, but are we assuming that this, like Johann, who teaches children, does he not see himself as deserving of blame for his actions?
Yes, so the idea is we're not going to construct a full good mental picture of him. The idea is that at least in this moment, he's ready to blame others and not think of his own. Because even people unreflectively, you'll see someone do something horrible and you'll be like, man, I do that crap all the time, right? So the idea is basically that this Johann is, and also if I didn't find hypocrisy that well, I'm sorry about that, but there's actually different accounts that are like, how about a hypocritical disposition? That might get us where we want to better, right? So it might be that Fritz and Miller do a dispositional account, like a differential kind of ability to hold people accountable, and the idea is instead of just being like this one instance of hypocrisy, let's look at how the entire person actually acts in the world and see whether or not that his disposition to blame that way is important. But I don't know how unreflective or reflective Johann is, at least in this moment my general feeling he's unrepentant, so yes, he's unreflective, yeah. Okay, thank you.
What would you think if, let's say, Johann, instead of being a fellow child shover, was like a notorious thief?
Yes,
And he didn't think anything was wrong with that, but he still consulting David would be very opposed to stealing and that kind of thing. So would he still be the same amount of hypocrisy there?
So that's a great question. What are the actual similarities that need to be the case for it to be hypocritical, right? So basically, like what you're saying, like could a thief blame a child pusher? Can a child pusher blame a thief? That is, how similar does the wrongdoing have to be? Unfortunately, I didn't have time to get through with how similar the wrongdoing has to be. I would say that to a certain extent, one could, the analyses, at least I've read of this kind of question, which is an important question, actually aren't super robust. But I think the general idea is it has to be somewhat similar. At least it has to have properties that are kind of considerable. I think a thief and a child pusher, it might be that that's kind of counter the scenario, right? But that's a great question. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.